Well, welcome again to our journey. A few weeks ago, when I thought about this journey that we're on, I thought quickly about Hosea and Amos and Micah and some others we haven't dealt with yet. But I really hadn't tackled in my mind what it would mean to deal with Isaiah, because Isaiah is a unique collection under one title, because it's really three different preachers of three different centuries combined into one book. And so this week we're going to deal with Isaiah of Jerusalem, sometimes referred to as First Isaiah, which is the first 39 books in the prophet Isaiah presentation in the Bible. And probably there was a school of Isaiah that continued after Isaiah of Jerusalem preached, and that school was maintained through the centuries, which was not at all unusual. And then another prophet by the name of Isaiah took on the role of preaching leadership, and then a third one later on. So when the canon was put together, the Old Testament was put together, it was all combined into one in terms of the tradition of the prophets named Isaiah. And so Isaiah of Jerusalem was a contemporary of the other three prophets that we've dealt with. His lifespan probably 742 to BC to 689 BC, over those 50 years. And the important thing to remember about Isaiah of Jerusalem is that both the northern and southern kingdom had fallen into the hands of Assyria. They no longer had two nations as they had grown to appreciate. They were now provinces of Assyria, and that was not necessarily a horrible military takeover. It just was an economic takeover and a power takeover by Assyria. But the important thing to remember is when Assyria came into Judah, the southern kingdom, which housed Jerusalem, Assyria forces and leadership stopped short of Jerusalem, and the temple was intact. And so Isaiah was preaching that indeed we've lost our nationhood, but we've still got Jerusalem, and kingship is still intact, even though we're a province of Assyria. So that's the historical context of Isaiah of Jerusalem that we need to remember when we hear his message. Now the message, there's a lot. In 39 books, 39 chapters in a book, there's a lot there. But let me just summarize the four main themes of his preaching. First of all, kings are divinely chosen. Isaiah hung on to the establishment understanding of kingship, and we'll get into that more as we progress this morning. Now, unfaithful kings are going to be punished. They're going to suffer punishment. But still, our hope is for the future is in kingship, because they are divinely chosen. Secondly, because of recent history, Isaiah was willing to say, hey, I think God protects Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will not be destroyed. The dynasty of King David is going to be intact in Jerusalem. Thirdly, the Hebrew people in the future are probably going to be a remnant, not a powerful nation controlling others. So the whole idea of the remnant begins to emerge. But finally, he opposed any rebellion against Assyria. You know, hey, we've lost our shirt politically. We deserve that. And rebellion against Assyria is not going to be fruitful in any way. So these are sort of the messages that we find in these 39 chapters. But I think what's important to remember about Isaiah of Jerusalem is that he created a foundation of thought for the preachers of the Hebrew people who followed him. That's the reason why Isaiah of Jerusalem is so important. And there are two passages that we're going to hone in on in First Isaiah and Isaiah of Jerusalem's message that we're going to really deal with next week in a far different way than we're dealing with them this week, because what Isaiah does is he paints a picture. He creates a portrait of a different kind of king. Now, it's a human king. It's a king that he's talking about. And that the only way that the Hebrew people are going to remain faithful to Deuteronomy 6:4, that second law that they cherish so much, to love God with your heart, soul, and strength. The only way that that's going to happen for us to be a faithful people is for us to have a different kind of king. And historians say that probably his hopes were in the king Hezekiah, that would become that kind of a king. But unless we have a different kind of king, unless we have a different kind of king expressing faithfulness and the love of God, we haven't got a chance. But Isaiah said, with a different kind of king, we will prevail as God's faithful people. Not in being all-powerful, but by being all-faithful. So, before we deal with these two passages, I want to again articulate what you've heard me say before, that I refer to these Old Testament leaders as preachers. We have learned to understand them, and they're referred to most commonly as prophets. The problem I have with that really comes to bear on First Isaiah, and that is that Isaiah was a preacher. He was talking about the kind of kingship that was needed at that point of history for the Jewish people. Now, what Christians have done with that later on is for next week, okay? But let's remember, he was preaching to the people, and this created a portrait of a new kind of king. So the first passage is going to include some familiar language, but let me read from Isaiah 9, beginning with verse 2. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. Thou shalt multiply the nation, again, kingship. Thou shalt increase their gladness. They will be glad in thy presence, as with the gladness of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For thou shalt break the yoke of their burden and the staff on their shoulders. The rod of their oppressor, as at the battle of Midian. For every boot of the booted warrior in the battle tumult, and cloak rolled in blood will be for burning, fuel for the fire. See how current it is talking about kingship still. And then it continues in verse 6. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on its shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government of peace. Remember, kingship, the governance of peace, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness for then on and forevermore. The seal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. You see how he believed that the kings were divinely chosen, and he paints this new portrait of the kind of king that we need. And when we remember these words that be wonderful, well, the establishment kings weren't necessarily a bunch of wonderful people. Counselor, a guide. No, they were interested in conquering, not guidance. Indeed, mighty God, chosen by the Eternal Father. And all of a sudden, it's the Prince of Peace. And we'll see this picked up in later Isaiah's as they preached. What a wonderful portrait. And think of how the establishment received the message of Isaiah. Indeed, yeah, kingship, yeah, the temple, but it's got to look different in the future than we've experienced it in the life of the establishment so far in our history. And then we turn to chapter 11, another dimension of the portrait. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse. Now Jesse was David's father. And a branch from his roots will bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will stay the wicked. Also righteousness will be the belt around his loins, and faithfulness the belt around his waist. And these are the words that we remember. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and the little boy will lead them. And then verse 10, then it will come about in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. What a portrait of a different kind of king than they've ever experienced before. And indeed, how consistent he is with Hosea, with Micah and Amos, and he will not judge with what his eyes see or judge by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge the poor. So we have this same emphases as we found in the other three early prophets. The difference being that Isaiah say, friends, our hope in the future is a different kind of king we've ever had before. And we are dependent upon that kind of leadership chosen by God. Indeed, we will be a remnant, not a powerful nation who conquers, but this is our future of faithfulness, living out Deuteronomy 6:4. Now, that's Isaiah of Jerusalem. Now, this raises a lot of questions for me. What are present-day illustrations of Isaiah's portrait of a king, an established leader, being a prince of peace over against the leader who conquers and wins? What are current day illustrations of those who have established power in kingship of the day, whatever our day is, who choose to be princes of peace rather than conquerors and winners? As we experience the words of chapter 11 that talks about opponents and enemies in the animal world being with one another, it's almost as if diversity is divine. So what illustrations do we find today where diversity is considered to be divine? Enjoy the week. We'll see you Sunday.